Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing The Catcher in the Rye, written by J.D. Salinger. And this book is one of the most popular books in American literature. It was published back in 1951. And apparently, the main character, Holden Caulfield, he was actually the protagonist of a short story that Salinger wrote called Slight Rebellion off Madison. But this is another book where I had to read it in high school. It's just one of those books that's part of our curriculum. And reading it now, I see the more of the criticism that people give about this book in terms of Holden himself and him just being this deeply flawed character. Because I first read this book when I was, I think, Holden's age. I was 16. I was a sophomore in high school or so, somewhere around there. And then I read it again years later just for the fun of it, and I still enjoyed it. And now I've read it, this is my third time reading it. And it's just, Holden just likes to complain about anything and everything, but most notably phonies, that he absolutely despises phonies. Anything with people acting like a phony, any phony situation, and yet there's such hypocrisy to that because he himself is a phony. He lies all the time. He tells us, the reader, that he is a terrific liar. He says right at the beginning of chapter 3, "I'm the most terrific liar you ever saw in your life. It's awful." I mean, gosh. And the other big thing about this book that I remember when we would discuss it in school, the whole big thing was that he's an unreliable narrator. And there are other books that are like that. Another one is, I haven't read it though, but it's Gone Girl. And I won't spoil it if you haven't read it or if you haven't seen the movie, but that's another big unreliable narrator telling the story. And the reason Holden is an unreliable narrator is because we learn at the very beginning and at the very end of the novel that he's in a hospital and he is being treated for his mental health. And the other big thing, though, is that he exaggerates about so much stuff. And mostly it's comical, where he just says things, exaggerating numbers like, oh, there were 1 million people in the room. And he's very sarcastic. And the whole big theme of this novel is that it's Holden's refusal to grow up, that he associates the adult world as phony, and that he's still connected to his childhood, still wanting that innocence. And that is a main theme too, the idea of preserving innocence. And so I'm not going to go, and what I've been doing lately is I want to deviate from this more. I tend to over summarize the plots of books especially, but I mean when movies too. So I'm trying to deviate from that and just present these in different, more interesting ways. Because I mean, when I discussed The Outsiders, for instance, I just got so bogged down in the plot. Sometimes I can't help it because I just enjoy going through the book or the movie, whatever it is I'm discussing, and I just enjoy sharing my favorite lines and my favorite moments as I recap the plot. But in this case, the plot is extremely simple. It's just that Holden gets kicked out of his most recent school that he's attending, Prency Prep. Not Prency, I already forgot the name of the school. Pensy, my apologies. Pensy Preparatory Academy. And it's a college prep school. And he gets kicked out because he's failing in multiple classes. And this isn't the first time he's been kicked out of school. And so then, instead of going home because he's afraid of what his parents are going to say or anything like that, he just spends the night in New York. And it's basically just a string of one-on-one conversations. And the most interesting parts in the novel to me are just Holden's stream of consciousness and his opinion about all of these characters that he meets or situations he gets himself into. And he's just extremely opinionated. And what I do like about this novel is his very unique way of speaking. Like when he says things like, what I thought I'd do, I thought I'd, or just things like that. I really did. Just him calling people old, like old Phoebe, old whomever, meaning like that's his term of endearment for them in a way. Just like my old pal, kind of like that. Also him saying stuff like, that killed me, like he finds things hilarious. And the first thing I just want to point out is how Holden perceives himself. This is early on in the first chapter, where Holden says, I was 16 then, and I'm 17 now, and sometimes I act like I'm about 13. It's really ironical because I'm 6'2.5" and I have gray hair. I really do. The one side of my head, the right side, is full of millions of gray hairs. I've had them ever since I was a kid. And yet I still act sometimes like I was only about 12. Everybody says that, especially my father. It's partly true too, but it isn't all true. People always think something's all true. I don't give a damn, except that I get bored sometimes when people tell me to act my age. Sometimes I act a lot older than I am. I really do. But people never notice it. People never notice anything. So, right away there is that stubbornness, that he doesn't want to grow up. And that's a whole big thing with why he got kicked out, because he didn't quote-unquote apply himself. He doesn't take school seriously. He doesn't seem to take anything seriously. And so with the theme of innocence, the first thing I want to touch upon is that symbolism of Holden's fascination with the ducks in the pond and where they go in the winter. And I remember discussing that back in high school and our teacher saying that's a symbolism for change. But change in the sense that it's temporary change, because the ducks, they fly away during the winter and then they come back in the spring. And Holden first mentions them early on in the novel, where he says, the funny thing is, though, I was sort of thinking of something else while I shot the bull. I live in New York, and I was thinking about the lagoon in Central Park, down near Central Park South. I was wondering if it would be frozen over when I got home, and if it was, where did the ducks go? I was wondering where the ducks went when the lagoon got all icy and frozen over. I wondered if some guy came in a truck and took them away to a zoo or something, or if they just flew away. And apparently this is also symbolism for Holden's childlike innocence, this connection where he still has that wonder in him, because most of the time he's just extremely cynical. He's already this kind of jaded person. He's only 16 years old. And he tries to always act older than he is, especially when the fact that he says he has gray hair, or the fact that he's always trying to order alcoholic beverages, even though he's underage. And he's able to get away with it in some places that he goes to. And he's also interested, of course, in sex, and he admits, though, that he's a virgin. But that's something that he connects with being an adult, because he always talks about how he wouldn't really be able to have sex with someone unless he actually loved them. That he doesn't understand how people just have casual sex, basically. Because there was also that part with when he just gets involved with a prostitute, he says, okay, I'll have the prostitute come up to his room, but then he can't go through with it. But to finish this through line with the ducks, there is a point when Holden asks the cab driver where the ducks go, and the cab driver is saying, what are you talking about? He has no clue. And then another point later on, when he asks another cab driver, and this one he says, how the hell should I know? How the hell should I know a stupid thing like that? And then he instead talks about the fish, saying, well, the fish don't go no place. They stay right where they are, the fish, right in the goddamn lake. And then Holden thinks about that and he says, all right, what do they do, the fish and all, when the whole little lake's a solid block of ice, people skating on it and all? And the cab driver, the crabby cab driver, he says, what the hell you mean, what do they do? They stay right where they are, for Christ's sake. And Holden says, they can't just ignore the ice. They can't just ignore it. Who's ignoring it? Nobody's ignoring it. They live right in the goddamn ice. It's their nature, for Christ's sake. They get frozen right in one position for the whole winter. And Holden's still interested. He says, yeah, what do they eat then? I mean, if they're frozen solid, they can't swim around looking for food and all. Their bodies, for Christ's sake. What's the matter with you? Their bodies taking nutrition and all, right through the goddamn seaweed and crap that's in the ice. They got their pores open the whole time. That's their nature, for Christ's sake. See what I mean? Oh. He just says, oh. And then later on, when he is drunk and it's late at night, he stumbles into Central Park and he goes around looking for the ducks. He says, I kept walking and walking, and it kept getting darker and darker and spookier. I didn't see one person the whole time I was in the park. I'm just as glad. I probably would have jumped about a mile if I had. Then finally I found it. What it was partly frozen and partly not frozen, but I didn't see any ducks around. I walked all around the whole damn lake. I damn near fell in once, in fact, but I didn't see a single duck. I thought maybe if there were any around, they might be asleep or something near the edge of the water, near the grass and all. That's how I nearly fell in, but I couldn't find any. And another big thing, a big symbolic object in this novel that I'm sure you remember is Holden's red hunting hat. It's first mentioned early on, where Holden says, I took off my coat and my tie and unbuttoned my shirt collar, and then I put on this hat that I'd bought in New York that morning. It was this red hunting hat with one of those very, very long peaks. I saw it in the window of this sports store when we got out of the subway, just after I noticed I'd lost all the goddamn foils. It only cost me $1. The way I wore it, I swung the old peak way around to the back. Very corny, I'll admit, but I liked it that way. I looked good in it that way. So, this hat becomes symbolism for Holden's individuality, and yet he is self-conscious when he wears it, because he always makes a point to say when he puts it on, saying that he doesn't give a damn how he looks. And then he takes it off when he goes into the hotel, things like that, when he's meeting the girl that he used to go out with, Sally. He puts it on, for instance, after he gets into a physical fight with his roommate Stradlater. And he gets into a fight with him because he's basically jealous and angered by the fact that Stradlater possibly slept with his childhood friend and crush, evidently, Jane Gallagher. He asks, did you give her the old time in the back seat of the car? And then Stradlater won't answer. And then he just tries to punch him, and then Stradlater just beats him up. And then he's all bloodied and bruised, but he doesn't even care. He puts on his hat, and he thinks, that's it, I'm getting the hell out of here. And before he leaves, he just shouts, "Sleep tight, you morons." So it gives him this confidence boost, and it's, in a way, this symbolism for him showing his true self. And then toward the end of the novel, he gives the hat to his little sister Phoebe. So he has a younger sister named Phoebe, an older brother named DB, which is interesting. Just think about that for a second. That's his initials. We don't know his real name, the brother. And Holden says, oh, he's a phony because he's out in Hollywood writing movies. He's a screenwriter. So it's just an interesting little side point. But there's also his younger brother, Allie, who sadly died young. And there are moments where Holden clearly isn't over the trauma of losing his younger brother at such a young age. But with Phoebe, when he gives her the hunting hat, he says, "Then I took my hunting hat out of my coat pocket and gave it to her. She likes those kind of crazy hats. She didn't want to take it, but I made her. I'll bet she slept with it on. She really likes those kind of hats. Then I told her again I'd give her a buzz if I got a chance, and then I left." And then he writes a note saying that he's going to skip town, basically, and just hitchhike out west. Because there's also a point where, when he's on the date with Sally Hayes, where he's saying, let's just get out of here and go move away together. And Sally says how there'll be time to do that when we're older, after we finish school and all of that. And then Holden says, I said no, there wouldn't be marvelous places to go to after I went to college and all. Open your ears, it'd be entirely different. We'd have to go downstairs in elevators with suitcases and stuff. We'd have to phone up everybody and tell them goodbye and send them postcards from hotels and all. And I'd be working in some office making a lot of dough, and riding to work in cabs and Madison Avenue buses, and reading newspapers and playing bridge all the time, and going to the movies and seeing a lot of stupid shorts and coming attractions and newsreels. Newsreels, Christ almighty. There's always a dumb horse race, and some dame breaking a bottle over a ship, and some chimpanzee riding a goddamn bicycle with pants on. It wouldn't be the same at all. You don't see what I mean at all. So that's the thing, it's just him wanting to escape the responsibilities of adulthood, just live out his life up in a cabin. There's another part, too, toward the end, when he brings up this idea of just running away again, and he says, what I'd do, I'd let old Phoebe come out and visit me in the summertime and on Christmas vacation and Easter vacation, and I'd let DB come out and visit me for a while if he wanted a nice, quiet place for his writing. But he couldn't write any movies in my cabin, only stories and books. I'd have this rule that nobody could do anything phony when they visited me. If anybody tried to do anything phony, they couldn't stay. Just this made-up reality of this cabin that's this sanctuary away from phoniness. There's also symbolism with the fact, with the mentioning of horses. For instance, he says a lot things about horsing around, as in clowning around, or also horsing around as in making out with a girl. And the imagery of horses is also symbolic with the school itself that he's kicked out of, Pensy Prep, where he says, right at the beginning of the novel, they advertise in about 1,000 magazines, always showing some hotshot guy on a horse jumping over a fence. Like as if all you ever did at Pensy was play polo all the time. I never even once saw a horse anywhere near the place. And underneath the guy on the horse's picture, it always says, since 1888 we have been molding boys into splendid, clear-thinking young men. So the whole point is that this school is meant to get students prepared for adulthood and focusing on their future and getting a good college education, preparing them for college, thus for the real world. And the copy that I have of this book doesn't have the cover, the original cover, unfortunately, but the classic cover for this book is, of course, that image of the horse on the carousel. And it doesn't show up until the very end of the novel when Phoebe is riding around on the carousel and she asks Holden if he will go on it with her, but he just says, "Oh, I'll sit and watch you right on the bench," and he watches her. And that is symbolic of him finally coming to terms with his burgeoning adulthood. And that maybe things will turn out okay. It's really the most positive and encouraged and, frankly, the happiest moment for him in the entire novel, right at this very end point, where he says how it starts to rain, but that he doesn't care. He just sits there getting soaked, watching Phoebe, and he says, "I got pretty soaking wet, especially my neck and my pants. My hunting hat really gave me quite a lot of protection in a way, but I got soaked anyway. I didn't care, though. I felt so damn happy all of a sudden, the way old Phoebe kept going around and around. I was damn near bawling. I felt so damn happy, if you want to know the truth. I don't know why. It was just that she looked so damn nice, the way she kept going around and around in her blue coat and all. God, I wish you could have been there." And the nice part, too, about the hunting hat is that after he gives it to Phoebe, then she wants to go away with him, too. She brings her suitcase and everything, and then he finally tells her that he's not going to go away, that he's going to go back home to their parents and deal with the whole falling out of getting kicked out of Pensy. And then in this scene when Phoebe goes on the carousel, when Holden has the hunting hat again, and he says, "Then what she did, it damn near killed me. She reached in my coat pocket and took out my red hunting hat and put it on my head." So it's just a nice, pure moment of Phoebe as this symbolism of innocence, and she herself as a child, she's 10 years old, just putting the hat on his head as a sign of acceptance and that things are going to be okay, and just embrace who you are. And it's very sweet, such a really nice moment. And another thing about the hunting hat is actually the fact that it's a red hat. That's also a symbol for childhood innocence in a way, because Holden also makes a point to point out that their younger brother Allie had red hair and Phoebe has red hair. And the other thing with the horses is the fact that when she's riding on the carousel, she rides around on a horse. And that is the image on the cover. The horse on the carousel. And the other big thing I want to discuss is the title itself. I always love that point when you're reading a novel and you get to the part where the title is explained. And so the title of this book, Catcher in the Rye, when Holden is talking to Phoebe. There's also a part 2, I just want to mention this part, when he buys her a record, Little Shirley Beans, and then he drops the record because he's drunk and it smashes into a million billion pieces, whatever Holden says, his usual exaggeration. And then he shows them to Phoebe and she says, "Give them to me, I want to keep them," which is sweet. That even though it's broken pieces of plastic, she wants to keep it. Just the gesture alone is nice. there is a whole part where Phoebe asks Holden what he likes, because he doesn't seem to like anything. She says, you don't like school, you don't like a million things, you don't. And she asks him to name one thing that he likes. And he thinks about Allie. He also thinks about a boy who sadly committed suicide at one of his old schools. And he just tells her he likes Allie. And he says, and I like doing what I'm doing right now, sitting here with you and talking and thinking about stuff. And Allie's dead. You always say that. If somebody's dead and everything and in heaven, then it isn't really... I know he's dead. Don't you think I know that? I can still like him, though, can't I? Just because somebody's dead, you don't just stop liking them, for God's sake. Especially if they were about 1,000 times nicer than the people you know that are alive and all. And so then the part explaining the title of the novel is when she asks him what he wants to be. And he gives it some thought. And finally he says, you know that song, If a Body Catch a Body Coming Through the Rye? It's If a Body Meet a Body Coming Through the Rye, old Phoebe said. It's a poem by Robert Burns. I know it's a poem by Robert Burns. She was right, though. It is If a Body Meet a Body Coming Through the Rye. I didn't know it then, though. I thought it was If a Body Catch a Body, I said. Anyway, I keep picturing all these little kids playing some game in this big field of rye and all. Thousands of little kids, and nobody's around. Nobody big, I mean, except me. And I'm standing on the edge of some crazy cliff. What I have to do, I have to catch everybody if they start to go over the cliff. I mean, if they're running and they don't look where they're going, I have to come out from somewhere and catch them. That's all I'd do all day. I'd just be the catcher in the rye and all. I know it's crazy, but that's the only thing I'd really like to be. I know it's crazy. So that is representative of Holden wanting to preserve innocence. So that's the whole point of the novel, the preservation of innocence. And how he can't do that by himself. That's impossible. People grow up and through new experiences, you gain better insight into the world, and it doesn't have to be a bad thing growing up. That's the whole thing that he has to face. But there are other points in the novel, too, where when he's waiting around for Phoebe and he goes to the old school and he sees the words F you written on the wall, he keeps erasing it, and he sees one also at the museum. The whole thing with the museum, too, he talks about how he likes it because everything is under glass. Nothing can change there. And that every time you go there, maybe something about you is different. Maybe you're a little older. You have been through new things. And so nothing in that world when you go to the museum changes except for you. And again, change, going back to the ducks, the theme with that. Change doesn't have to be a bad thing. Sometimes it's temporary. In that case, it's cyclical. The ducks, they leave, but then they come back. And so Holden finally comes to terms with all that. And then by the end, when he says he got sick and he's in the hospital, and he says how people are asking if he's going to apply himself, and he says, well, I think I am, but how do I know? I swear it's a stupid question. So hopefully Holden, he learns his lesson, but it's left ambiguous that he doesn't know how it's going to end up. Another thing, too, I just want to mention is the fact that he allows his own cynical nature to derail him and not take action. For instance, when he always talks about how he's going to give old Jane Gallagher a buzz, but then he keeps basically thinking himself out of it, thinking his way out of it. Like, oh, you got to be in the mood to do that. Or, oh, I didn't want to call and because maybe her mom is home. And then when he does call at one point, it's the parents and he just hangs up really quick. Because it seems like he was in love with Jane. And he does describe like certain memories about her and how they never actually, they would hold hands, and he said it was just nice we could just hold her hand. Or how he never actually went out with her. and how he always wonders why she always kept her kings in the back row when they played checkers. Just little things like that. Or with Allie, with his younger brother who passed, when his roommate Stradlater asks him to write a composition for him. Because that's the thing about Holden. I might as well mention that too. Even though he's a bad student, he excels at English. And he excels at writing. And when he writes the composition, he just has to be descriptive. And he just writes about Allie's old baseball mitt and how he had all poems written on it. So those are the few things that he truly appreciates, besides his overall aversion to growing up and phoniness. So this book is a classic. It has been deemed a controversial book. It's been banned and stuff in the past, which I think is just all blown out of proportion, but that's just how things are with books like this. But it's a classic for a reason. Holden is just an interesting character, even though he is a complainer, but just that theme of being stuck between childhood and adulthood. That's a hard time in anyone's life. And this book, just a random little fact, it was never made into a movie, but they said that if anyone would have played Holden, it would have been J.D. Salinger himself. And he based a lot of the childhood memories on his own childhood. So it's a classic. Just that fantasy of Holden's wanting to preserve innocence as the catcher in the rye, catching kids, for them to preserve their innocence and for him to preserve his own. So it is a great novel. And that killed me. And with that, that's going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, I'm going to be discussing a short story called Who Will Greet You at Home. It's from a book of short stories called What It Means When a Man Falls from the Sky by Leslie Neka Arima. And I have a fun story to share about why I purchased the book in the first place. It has to do with a recommendation by a creator of one of my all-time favorite TV shows. And I happened to have met him a couple years ago, and I mentioned the book to him. So I'll discuss all that next week. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.